Month of October, scary season, I've reread Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, this is a reread, sort of. I did this originally as an audiobook way back in 2001, so over 20 years ago now, and it was as an audiobook. I didn't actually read through the physical pages, which is what I've done this time. Also, in the years before I did this as an audiobook, and actually in the years since, I've read this numerous times as an abridged or simplified version. Some of this is in my work as an English language teacher, an ESL teacher. I've used easy English versions of Dracula in my classroom. But this is the first time going back to the original novel, the full original novel, since 2001, and the first time actually reading it through as a physical book. So I just finished this yesterday, and I'm going to try to organize my thoughts on this and hopefully make something worthwhile. We'll see how this goes. I've got a couple disclaimers. One is, and I know I say this every time, but I'm a little bit tired right now. It's late at night. So hopefully my brain will be working and I won't lose coherence. In an ideal world, I would wait until I was fully rested before attempting this, but that's never going to happen. Anne Lamott had a good quote on her documentary Bird by Bird when she said, when you have a kid, you're just always on borrowed time. I could wait for tomorrow to film this, but I'm going to be just as tired tomorrow. I've got two kids and three jobs, and I'm just always on borrowed time. The other thing, I don't know if you can hear this, but I've got a little bit of a froggy throat. I've got some lounges here and a glass of milk, and hopefully this will get me through, but apologies. And then the one more disclaimer is I'm borrowing. As I read this book, I watched a few other YouTube reviews of this by Overly Sarcastic Productions, by Paperback Journeys, a number of Steve Donahue's thoughts on this book. He's done several videos of it. I think one was his Daily Penguin and one was a Dracula read-along he did. So I am borrowing knowledge that I got from those videos. I'll try to remember to leave a link in the description to everything I just mentioned, as well as, of course, other resources like Wikipedia. Okay, with that all out of the way, let me try and get into my thoughts. So I think I speak for a lot of modern readers when I say I'm generally fascinated by the idea of Dracula, classic movie monster, classic horror icon. And yet, again, I think I'm speaking for a lot of modern readers here. I found the book to be a little bit boring and a little bit of a slog. That's more or less how I remembered it from when I did it as an audiobook in 2001. And coming back to the reread, I had those feelings confirmed. Now, there are moments of brilliance in here. There are certain scenes that are riveting. And I think it's tempting to say that those certain scenes make up for a lot. They make up for the slow parts. So I go along with that. The really good scenes make up for it all. But there are a lot of slow parts to this. And that seems to be, I think, to the consensus of most booktubers I've seen who have reviewed this. Now, you do have to keep in mind with a book like this that we're operating as modern readers from two disadvantages. One disadvantage is that everybody knows that in the 19th century, attention spans were different. So this book was written in 1897, still in the Victorian era. And if you've read any 19th century book, that the pacing and the descriptions and just the level of how quickly the reader was expected to get bored, all of that was calibrated differently. Now, I regret to say that I'm not well read enough to really have a good feel for what was normal in Victorian literature. I do feel like some of the books were better than others, or some of the books were fairly fast paced. I think that Three Musketeers is an example of a book that I think still holds up by modern standards of pacing. Around the World in 80 Days is another example. What are some more examples? The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. So you know, like there are some books that I think do are still page turners by modern standards, but it's definitely not all of them. I feel like those books are the exception. Dracula definitely moves slowly by modern standards. That being said, though, somebody who is incredibly well read is Steve Donahue. Uh, he definitely knows what a Victorian era book was like. And I've been watching his videos from last year when he did the Dracula read aloud, and commented as he was reading each chapter, which was really fun. Go and check out his videos. He was definitely of the opinion that Bram Stoker had chapters where he was putting in a lot of superfluous detail that should have been cut out. Um, so Steve Donahue's opinion is, even by the standards of the Victorian era, there was some padding in this book that could have been cut out. Some descriptions that went on a little bit too long. He says in some of his videos, there's absolutely no reason for for this to be in the book. There's no reason for us to be reading this. No, he is definitely a fan of the book. He holds up that the really great scenes make up for a lot. But yeah, there are some slow parts. So that's one disadvantage, the time disconnect between us and the Victorians. The other disadvantage, of course, is Dracula is a victim of its own success. I mean, you can imagine how readers originally reacted to this when it came out for the first time in 1897. But you can only imagine. You can't really feel it yourself. So for us, reading this book after being so saturated with Dracula and vampires in the media, uh, everything kind of feels a little bit done. Like Dracula shows up and he doesn't show. He comes up from behind a character and he doesn't show up in the mirror, and it's like a big shocking scene, and you're like, yeah, I know vampires don't show up in mirrors. I've seen this before 100 times, right? Just kind of the vampire lore in general, which my understanding is largely invented by this book. I mean, I understand there are vampires going all the way back to ancient Greece or whatever, but the vampire as we know it in like modern Hollywood was largely invented by this book. Or this has been the blueprint for them since. So not only are we familiar with vampires in general, but the Dracula story specifically. I think a lot of us know the beats of this story very well just through the movies, even if we've never read the book. That being said, again, to return to what Steve Donahue said, and what I've heard some other people say as well, is that Bram Stoker, even in his day, was not regarded as a great writer. Steve Donahue makes a point a few times that none of his other books are remembered today. I mean, that they're still in the libraries. They survive in the sense that the print copy is still available, but nobody reads them. Nobody remembers them. And Dracula, Dracula, even in its day, I think, was regarded as a triumph of idea over style, substance over style, perhaps. So there are some really cool ideas in here, but the prose styling wasn't regarded as great even in its day. Although, again, that being said, for my money, when this thing sings, it really sings. When there's a key chapter where stuff is really happening, I think the prose can actually be quite good. Uh, as somebody who's dabbled in writing fiction myself, it's much better than anything I can do. No matter what the critics might say about Bram Stoker. Um, and again, Steve Donahue. Sorry, I'm over reliant on Steve Donahue. So Steve Donahue is of the opinion, I think, that because Bram Stoker was so embedded with the theater, he worked in the theater, that he was able to write the theatrical parts of it quite well. Actually, I'm referencing stuff Steve said. Steve Donahue also thinks that the structure of this book was heavily influenced by somebody who had just imbibed the 5-act structure of the theater, where there's kind of like 5 little mini climaxes that punctuate the book. So it's not just one big climax at the end, that there are kind of 5 shocking moments spread throughout the book. Each would have been the end of an act in a play. And in fact, my understanding, again, this comes from Steve, is even before the 1931 Bela Lugosi movie, this thing was very popular in stage adaptations, which is part of the reason its popularity survived into the 20th century. Okay. So I think the best way to organize my thoughts on this, and I do realize it's 11 minutes in and I'm just barely getting started on this, but the best way to organize my thoughts on this is to attempt to go through it chronologically, describe the story, give my comments, maybe spoil some things as I go. Definitely spoil some things as I go. Spoiler alert. And we'll see how well this works out. So the book starts off with a real estate agent, Jonathan Harker, who is going to Castle Dracula in Transylvania to finalize the details of a real estate deal. Dracula is buying an old house in London. Jonathan Harker is the agent from the real estate company. So he is traveling through the Kingdom of Hungary and the land of Transylvania, and there's a fair bit of local color thrown in here. I don't know how much of it is accurate, but it is interesting. Now, as luck would have it, during the same month while I was reading this book, I've also been in my podcast life listening to Revolutions by Mike Duncan, and I'm on season 7, the 1848 Revolutions, which deals with the Kingdom of Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was just interesting for me to see a lot of the same names and terminology pop up. I mean, there's not a lot of hard history in here, but just things like the Magyars, the Slovaks. Transylvania actually has a major part in the 1848 revolution, so that was being mentioned. So just kind of, I don't know, just help me to get involved in the setting. Now, that being said, I do think that Bram Stoker is exaggerating and exoticizing the Hungarian lands. I guess it's Romanian lands, but Romania was, I believe, a part of the Kingdom of Hungary at that time. I think maybe even at the time it would have been referred to as Orientalism. I mean, I know that the meaning of Oriental has shifted, but I think in the 19th century, Orient referred to kind of the lands of Turkey, right? In anything past the Gallipoli Peninsula. I think it's a kind of exoticism of the Eastern Europeans that would be considered politically incorrect today. Not to mention the mention of the word gypsy. I don't think you're supposed to say gypsy anymore, right? But they talk about gypsies in this book as part of it. Oh, the other thing I should mention is that the entire book is written as a documentary evidence book. So there's no one narrator. It's all just kind of found footage, as it were, found documents. So it starts off with Jonathan Harker's journal. Jonathan Harker being the main character for the first 4 chapters, and it's all told from his perspective in his journal. Then from chapter 5, we switch perspectives. We leave Jonathan Harker still in Castle Dracula. We'll come back to him, don't worry. And we go to England and we get the letters between Lucy and Mina, and it's told through their letters. And one thing that Bram Stoker is trying to do is to try and switch up the narrative sources. So we get extract from people's letters, extracts from people's journals, telegrams. Occasionally a newspaper article will be inserted in here. I mean, not a real newspaper article, but a real newspaper article within the world of this book, if you follow me. One of the characters, Jack Seward, actually uses a phonograph to keep his diary. So he is dictating his diary into a phonograph. Now, the reason for that detail, I'm not entirely sure, except I believe I heard somewhere, I think this was in the preface to the audiobook I read back in 2001, listened to back in 2001, that Bram Stoker was just trying to vary the sources of the story as much as possible, the methods. And phonograph at that time was cutting edge technology, so it was just kind of something that was interesting for him to put into. And I didn't even know that you could dictate into a phonograph like it was a recording device, huh? I thought, I don't know, I guess it shows how ignorant I am, huh? I thought you couldn't really record yourself until those tape recorders came out in like the 70s or 80s. But I guess how did that work? Recording yourself into a phonograph. It's mentioned in here the word cylinders, which makes me imagine like a cylinder, like a tube. But maybe a cylinder would be like a round record. I don't know. I mean, I always thought records were kind of pressed in factories. That's how they made their grooves, right? So how would you dictate into a phonograph to create a recording? I don't know. And I guess that raises the question, was Bram Stoker even accurate in this? There are some details in here which Bram Stoker was not accurate on. I guess the other example, while I'm on this discussion, is blood transfusion. So all the characters are giving blood transfusions all the time because, for some mysterious reason, some characters are losing blood and nobody can explain it. So the other characters have to give them blood transfusions, and they never check the blood type. They're never even concerned about it. They're just like, all right, hook them up. We're doing the transfusion. And it struck me a little bit strange at the time, but I don't know that much about science or medicine. But then I was listening to the video from Overly Sarcastic Productions, and they said, they didn't know about blood types at that time. The blood transfusion was another cutting edge technology thing that Bram Stoker was just on the edge of. Sorry, I went off on a few digressions there, didn't I? Coming back to the beginning of the story, Jonathan Harker is in Transylvania. The story is told from his journal excerpts for the first 4 chapters. So he's going to Castle Dracula, where he ends up staying for what is supposed to be a short time, but then Dracula kind of traps him in the castle, and he stays there for a longer time. And this is where we get all the great kind of gothic parts about Dracula. the castle up on the mountain in the fog with the moon and the wolves howling. Um, Overly Sarcastic Productions in their video mentioned that this was pretty standard for Gothic horror at the time. Now, I have no idea what they're talking about because the only Gothic horror book I know of from that time is Dracula. But, I guess presumably there's a lot of other books from that time that nobody reads anymore, right? That professors still read. They haven't been destroyed. They're still in libraries somewhere, but nobody actively reads them. So maybe that's what they're referring to. Maybe these stories are maybe this was already considered a cliche at the time. I don't know. While I'm on the topic, Overly Sarcastic Productions says that the thing that makes Dracula unique is that Dracula goes to London, which is where the majority of the book takes place. So the first 4 chapters are, I mean, it took me a while to work through them, but they're only 40 pages out of 365. Okay, so Jonathan Harker is in Dracula's castle. You've got all this spooky stuff going on, the wolves howling, these mysterious women at night, etc. It's all great atmosphere. And yet I do have to say I tired of it a little bit. And part of it is what I mentioned earlier. The modern reader just kind of knows all this stuff already. So stuff that's supposed to be shocking, like Dracula not showing up in the mirror, are just not as exciting now as presumably they were when this book was first written. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, I know he doesn't show up in the mirror. I already know he's a vampire. I already know he's changing into a bat. I already know he's sleeping in the coffin. And I'm assuming that the reader in 1897 did not know all that, so maybe those chapters were more interesting. The other thing about these first 4 chapters, these first 40 pages, is they're a little bit repetitive. So Jonathan Harker will meet Dracula. They'll kind of talk for a little bit. Dracula always meets him at night, never during the day. It's always very mysterious. Of course, we, the modern reader, know exactly what's going on, but it's presented through Jonathan Harker's diary as something that's mysterious. And then there will be a few strange things that Jonathan Harker notices, and then Dracula will say goodbye, and he goes to sleep, and then the next day, and it just goes on like that for several days without, in my opinion, without feeling like the plot is going somewhere. By the time we left Castle Dracula at the end of page 40, I was glad to leave it. I felt like that part of the book was getting a little bit claustrophobic. The other thing that I might as well mention now, which I think applies to the whole book, is I don't know, what do you guys think? Is 365 pages maybe too long to stretch out this Gothic thing? This is something maybe I should have mentioned at the top of the review, but I feel like this is another thing working against the book. I mean, I like a good spooky story as much as the next guy. But, a good 90-minute, 2-hour movie is good, and then I can get on with my life and go do something different. For Dracula, in this edition, it's 365 pages. I know some people on BookTube read amazingly quickly. I'm not one of them. I think I have what is closer to the average reading speed, or maybe about the slow end of average. I read about 20 pages in an hour, and I might only have an hour to read during the day. So for a 365 page book, this is like my reading for the month, and I mean, this practically was. We're here at the tail end of October now, and I've just finished this off. So to spend that much time in kind of a spooky atmosphere gets I I'm not sure I want to immerse myself in it for that long. At a certain point, the it just feels a little bit boring. Like, oh, okay, and a little bit depressing. All those dark nights and dark vampires. Good for a 2 hour movie, but I. How did you guys feel about this? Those of you who have read the book, but did you feel like the atmos? Did you feel like you wanted to be immersed in that atmosphere for the whole book, or did you feel like at a certain point you were like, oh, okay, that's enough kind of gothic horror for now. Let me pick up a fantasy book for a while or something. I don't know. Maybe that gets back to the pacing again. Okay. Then, after page 40, we leave Transylvania and go to. Oh, no. Sorry. I'm just realizing here I was off. First 4 chapters, 53 pages. 53 pages is the first 4 chapters. Okay, so after 53 pages, chapter 5, now we're back in England, and we're introduced to Lucy and Mina, our 2 heroines for the story. And they are writing letters back and forth to each other. Now, what did you guys think about Lucy and Mina, those of you who have read the book? Was it just me, or were they incredibly bland characters? And also, were they kind of the same character? I mean, their character arcs are definitely different. So when we first meet Lucy, she's got 3 men who are madly in love with her, and she has to choose among them. When we first meet Mina, she's got her steady boyfriend, Jonathan Harker, who she's been dating for a long time. And then from there, of course, their arcs spiral out in completely different directions. One of them has a happy ending in this book, and one of them does not. Spoilers. But aside from their situations being a little bit different and their character arcs being different, they both seem to me to be like the same bland character, just a very kind of pure woman who's always described by the other characters as being so lovely and sweet and kind, etc. I also would be curious, maybe how the women readers feel about their characterizations. There are a lot of comments that seem to downgrade the position of women here. I mean, on one hand, they're both held up as these really kind of pure objects of just innocence and purity. But on the other hand, I mean, right from the first chapter when we get introduced to them, Lucy is saying, what is she saying? She's saying something like, she's talking about all the men who love her and how gallant they are. And she's saying something like, oh, men are, oh yeah. Oh, my dear Mina, why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them? Things like that. And, of course you have to keep in mind it's a male author who's writing in the voice of the women. But there are frequent comments like that, referring to the frailty of women. There's one comment about how the women like to tease men because of some lingering influence of Eve and the apple. Steve Donahue, again, in one of his read-alouds of this book, just said in relation to one of those comments, well, there you go. That's proof, if you need it, that Bram Stoker is a misogynist. Now, misogynist is a word I like to be a little bit careful with, because I think it maybe has a weak meaning and a strong meaning. I mean, as a strong meaning, it maybe means somebody who passionately, violently hates women. I think that's the word literally translates to women hater, right? But as a weak meaning, it could mean just somebody who has some outdated stereotypes of women, or don't think that women can do all the things that men can do. And that seems to be a view that's presented in this book, although, Bram Stoker is not the narrator. He is writing through his characters. So maybe it's the characters who have this view, not Bram Stoker, right? That's something you'll always have to think about when you're reading literature. Yeah, a couple more points to make on this, maybe. There are a number of characters in this book. It's I think one of the commentaries I read on this book said it's notable for having no single main character, but like a cast of characters that's fighting Dracula. So there's Jonathan Harker, the real estate agent. There's Lucy and Mina. Mina has three men who are in love with her: Jack Seward, Quincy Morris, and Arthur Holmwood, who will all go on to be supporting characters. And then there's Van Helsing, who come in. So that's, how many are we up to? Like eight characters who are in this quest against Dracula. Did I count that right? But not all of them are point of view characters, if that terminology makes sense. So like the Game of Thrones books has like a cast of like hundreds of characters, but there are only certain characters whose point of view we inhabit. Similar in this one, there's like 8 characters who are all more or less kind of equal in this quest against Dracula. But Arthur Holmwood, for whatever reason, the one who marries Lucy, has almost no point of view documents. I think a few short letters or few short journal entries near the end, but very short. I'm not exactly sure why that is, other than maybe we just didn't need him. Quincy Morris, Quincy Morris. Quincy Morris is the cowboy. He's a minor character in here. He's interesting for maybe a couple reasons. So he's the guy from Texas who's got his guns with him and talks. I think Bram Stoker couldn't make up his mind about how he wanted Quincy Morris to come out. There are quite a few chapters. Actually, sorry, let me back up here a minute. Let me back up. I get the impression, and again, always take me with a grain of salt because I'm not as well read as I could be, but I get the impression in Victorian England, there was a fascination with the American West. It seems like American cowboys show up in a lot of these Victorian novels. Like, I think they show up a couple times in Sherlock Holmes stories during this period. I think Jules Verne was French, but same period. And Around the World in 80 Days, his character spends some time in the American West. I think the America and the cowboy must have been a fascination in Europe at that time. So here's our nod to the American cowboy Quincy Morris showing up. He's got his guns with him. Occasionally, he shoots his guns off at stuff, like shoots off at a bat in one chapter. A reminder. I mean, I knew this, but it was an interesting reminder that the American fascination with guns goes way back. And if I'm currently living abroad. If any of you Americans out there have ever lived abroad, you'll know that the American view of guns the rest of the world doesn't quite get it. And there seems to be some indication that this was already the case back in the 1890s. But the other interesting thing is Quincy Morris is described more than once as laconic, or talking laconically, which I learned this a little bit from Dan Carlin. The word laconic comes from the Greek Laconia or something, which was the land where the Spartans lived, because the ancient Greek Spartans were famous for being men of few words who would just come out with, just kind of these short, pithy one-liners, but didn't like to gab a lot. And that's often how cowboys have been portrayed, as the laconic cowboy. Now, I had thought, I got this information somewhere, that the laconic cowboy was an invention of the 1950s Westerns. I think that the creator of Deadwood, the HBO TV series, I was watching an interview with him, and he was saying that cowboys, the stereotype of the laconic cowboy came about because of the Hays movie code wouldn't allow them to swear. So the screenwriters just made them into like the strong silent types instead. That was his justification for having cowboys who swore all the time in the TV show Deadwood. That's a tangent. But anyways, it's interesting that in the 1890s, the laconic cowboy was already a thing, because Quincy Morris is described several times as laconic, or talking laconically. That being said, even though the narrator will frequently ascribe that adjective to Quincy Douglas does go on sometimes to kind of gab a bit. So, yeah, where is it? Let me see if I can find that part. Like right when we first meet him, Lucy is describing him in her letter. Yeah. Sorry, I thought I would find this quicker than I did. Almost there. Yeah. So he's talking to Lucy, and he just rambles on here. Lucy, you're an honest-hearted girl, I know. I should not be here speaking to you as I am now if I did not believe you clean grit right through to the very depths of your soul. Tell me, like one good fellow to another, is there anything else that you care for? And if there is, I'll never trouble you a hair's breadth again, but will be, if you will let me, a very faithful friend. And then a little bit later, he goes on a bit longer. That's my brave girl. It's better worth being late for a chance of winning you than being in time for any other girl in the world. Don't cry, my dear. If it's for me, I'm a hard nut to crack, and I'll take it standing up. If that other fellow doesn't know his happiness, well, he'd better look for it soon, or he'll have to deal with me. Little girl, your honesty and pluck have made me a friend, and that's rarer than a lover. It's more selfish anyhow. My dear, I'm going to have a pretty lonely walk between this and Kingdom Come. Won't you give me one kiss? It'll be something to keep off the darkness now and then. You can, you know, if you like, for that other good fella. He must be a good fella, my dear, and a fine fella, or you could not love him. Hasn't spoken yet. So I don't know exactly what accent I'm going for. You can probably tell doing accents isn't my strong point, but you get the point. Right? Bram Stoker, I guess, couldn't decide if Quincy Morris was supposed to be the strong, laconic, silent cowboy, or this southern home wisdom spouting Texan. Quincy Morris is almost completely superfluous to the plot, which is why I mentioned at the beginning of this video I've read a number of abridged or simplified versions of Dracula. He almost always gets cut out of every version, and every movie version as well. I think he was in the Bram Stoker's Dracula. That what was that? Scorsese? Was that Scorsese or Coppola? That movie that came out in the 90s. I think he was in there. He's mostly just tagging along. Doesn't do any. He's not one of the point of view characters. I guess the reason for that is he's supposed to be the laconic type sometimes. And then he dies at the end. And what is kind of an effective death, but it's just a classic thing of like, you want to have somebody die at the end to kind of heighten up the drama and kind of have it be like there was one kind of sacrifice to it to achieve the victory, and so you take the most expendable character who doesn't really do anything and isn't really that valuable to the plot and have him be the one dying at the end. I mean he does. He's an interesting character for what he's worth. Van Helsing is another character who we hear about from the other characters, but we don't get his point of view. Now, the reason for that is obvious because Van Helsing appears to know from very early on what is going on with Lucy when she is losing blood. But he's, in a lot of these books, how you have that character who knows everything, but they don't say anything for really no good reason except that the author wants to keep you, the reader, in suspense. This is one of those books. Van Helsing has suspicions of vampire very early on, but he just keeps his mouth shut. So I guess doing the books from his doing the journal articles from his point of view would just spoil that game. Interestingly enough, Dr. Jack Seward, gets a fair bit of the narration here. Now he was one of Lucy's suitors, and he runs the madhouse where Renfield is. Now Renfield is, as you may know from the movie versions of this story, he's what would be the word for him? A madman, a mentally disturbed man who aids Dracula. Paperback Journeys, in his review of this book, pointed out that in the movie versions, Renfield is often a lot more attached to Dracula than he is in the book version. In the book version, the other thing, an interesting thing about the movie versions, I think particularly the 1931 Bela Lugosi version, and I think a couple other versions as well. In that version, Renfield was the real estate agent who went to Transylvania. Not Jonathan Harker, but Renfield. And he ended up going insane because he got put under Dracula's spell or bitten by Dracula. I don't remember. He was a victim of Dracula, which makes the character maybe more interesting, maybe increases the horror or the tragedy of his character arc. In the book, though, Renfield is just an inmate at the insane asylum who has some sort of psychic connection with Dracula and wants to help him. And Dr. Seward, who makes up a fair degree of the narration, is obsessed with chronicling Renfield. Renfield is like his case study. Steve Donahue, in his read aloud of these chapters, comments at one point that what we, the reader, are meant to take away from Jack Seward's obsessive interest in Renfield is that Seward is just as insane as Renfield is. Steve's a smarter man than I am, but I don't know. Was that Bram Stoker's intention? Or was that just a byproduct of the fact that Renfield just makes up so much of the narration here? The, what's interesting about how much Renfield takes up in terms of the book, the amount of pages dedicated to him, is he's, yeah, as Paperback Journeys kind of hinted in his video, Renfield, when it all comes down to it, is really not that essential to the plot. I mean, ultimately, he's responsible for inviting Dracula into the insane asylum, which allows Dracula to have access to Mina near the second half of the book, in the second half of the book. But aside from that, I mean, what was the point of chronicling Renfield's Renfield's insanities? Renfield's got this thing where he's trying to consume life. So he eats a bunch of flies, and then he feeds the flies to the spiders, and then he eats a bunch of spiders, and then he feeds the spiders to the birds, and then he eats the birds. And he's under this impression that by eating whole something alive, you are adding their life force to you. Now, this is, as far as I can tell, this is a little obsession he developed even before he established that psychic connection with Dracula. Now, this desire to increase his life force is what made Dracula's power so attractive to him. But the amount of space that's spent documenting Renfield's obsession with adding to his life force, given how little Renfield actually ends up mattering to the plot, and then he just gets killed off near the end, and then the story just moves on. Some of the parts with Renfield could be interesting. He's got this thing where he can appear completely insane. He's completely insane, but then he all of a sudden will appear completely sane, and he's able to mask his insanity. And at one point, when the other characters are being brought in to examine him, he so completely hides his insanity that he's able to talk with them with pleasantries and comment on the research they've been doing. Now, Steve Donahue, again, to reference his videos, makes a point of saying that this was how inmates at asylums were treated back in those days, in the Victorian era, just like animals in a zoo that you would come around and just gawk at or study. It makes a point of emphasizing that this was a big blind spot during that Bram Stoker himself was not aware of during the time, but that society has progressed beyond this. It's an interesting little side note. I've been rambling on for 45 minutes, and I haven't gotten to most of the stuff in this book. I'm gonna have to pick up my summarizing skills. Right. So the point of view narration is interesting. The cast of characters is interesting. Steve Donahue makes the point in his commentary that there are times when this works and there are times when it doesn't work. So times when it works would be when there's a bunch of short letters or short telegrams that's going back and forth between characters. Kind of sometimes telegrams are included in here. So I just opened my page right to it, so I'll read this out. This is the end of chapter 9. So it ends with 3 telegrams. So telegram, Seward, London to Van Helsing, Amsterdam. Patient better today. September 5, the next day. Telegram. Patient greatly improved, good appetite, sleeps naturally, good spirits, color coming back. September 6, the very next day, another telegram from Seward to Van Helsing. Terrible change for the worse. Come at once. Do not lose an hour. I hold over telegram to homeward till have seen you. So, those are great little punches. And there are other points as well where the short letters back and forth between the characters cater very much to a modern attention span, a modern sense of pacing, and give it good punches. There are other points that I think Steve Donahue makes this point very well, where we, because everything's being recounted as journal entries or letters, there are certain scenes that really would benefit from being described by a third-person omniscient narrator, like when Lucy is sleepwalking. And it's described in kind of Mina recounting it the next day in her journal. But Steve makes a point. I think he's right. It could have been so much more effective if you would just have a narrator like describe it as it was happening, and a few other scenes like that. But for the most part, it's an interesting narration technique, and when it works, it works. Okay. So, Dracula arrives in London. Oh, another interesting tidbit here. I've picked this up from a couple different sources. Kim Newman said this in his afterwards to Anno Dracula, and this was also on Wikipedia. But Dracula is apparently considered part of invasion literature. So what is invasion literature? Well, in the Victorian era, I believe starting in 1871, it was very popular in Victorian England to have books about an outside army invading England. So the original books in this genre were, I think it was called The Battle of Dorking or something like that, where there was this like German-speaking army that invaded England and conquered it. I've never actually read any of those books, but I imagine they must have been kind of like the Victorian equivalents of Red Dawn. You remember those Red Dawn movies? There was also a miniseries during the 80s. I forget the name of it. It was like America, where the Soviets also took over America. For whatever reason, these things were popular in the 80s. Soviets taking over America. So I guess the Germans taking over England was popular in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And there was a whole bunch of books about an outside army invading England. And some of the classics from the last half of the Victorian era are spins on this popular invasion literature. So War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells is actually a takeoff on the invasion literature that was popular at the time. Now, H.G. Wells changed it. So it wasn't an invading German army, it was an invading Martian army, but it was kind of the same idea. Dracula apparently is regarded also as a type of invasion literature because Dracula is a strange foreigner from the distant lands of Transylvania and the Hungarian Empire, where it's established quite clearly in the first 5 chapters what a strange foreigner he is and what a strange land it is. Comes into Victorian England, the home of everything pure, where these pure, sweet girls, Lucy and Mina are, and tries to launch his invasion of England, which is a one-man invasion of England. But it has the potential to spread out to be more than one person, because, of course, the vampires spread, right, through their bites. Although, interestingly enough, in Dracula, they don't spread the way they do in modern movies. So I think, like in a modern movie, if you get bit by a vampire, you automatically turn into a vampire immediately or within like a handful of hours. If I'm reading the novel right, in the world of Dracula, if you get bit by a vampire, you don't automatically turn into a vampire. You don't actually automatically die unless you eventually die from loss of blood if he sucks your blood several times, which is what happens to Lucy. Dracula sucks her blood multiple times over the course of many, many nights, probably far too many nights. I'll complain about that in a second. But it's not until she just kind of dies, I think, of exhaustion from the loss of blood that she then becomes a vampire. And then after Mina is bitten by Dracula, uh, Van Helsing says to her, you know, you could live out the rest of your natural life. You could live until you become an old woman. But death is going to take you sooner or later. And then as soon as death takes you, then you will become a vampire. Unless we can kill Dracula first. So that's the reason that they have to go in and kill Dracula. Which is the climax of the end of the book, chasing Dracula across Europe. So yeah, that's what's going on in England. Now, Dracula is preying on Lucy. And as I indicated beforehand, Paperback Journeys makes the same comment in his video, and I absolutely agree with him. It goes on for far too long. So Lucy's getting sick, she's getting better, she's getting sick, she's getting better. I mean, I think what's going on is, again, what I said before, it's not the vampire bite that automatically makes her a vampire. Or that kills her. It's just the loss of blood. So if Dracula will leave her alone for a little bit, and Dracula does leave her alone for some periods, either because she's being protected by Van Helsing, like there's garlic around her to keep Dracula away, or sometimes I think it's implied that Dracula just gets distracted by other things or is satiated with blood for a little while. Then Lucy will start to recover. And then Dracula will revisit her again, and then she'll go down. Now, the characters, the point of view characters who we're hearing this from, mostly Jack Seward. Yeah, mostly Jack Seward, who seems to be, for whatever reason, the main narrator of these sections, doesn't know that there's a vampire. And it's not until after Lucy dies that Van Helsing kind of finally reveals to the characters, the other characters, about the vampire. Now, arguably, this is too late. So that's another criticism you can make of the book, is Van Helsing kind of withholding knowledge when it might actually have done some good for no other purpose than to make the story more suspenseful. But yeah, it just goes on way too long, and well, I'm complaining about that, and I'm going to try and wrap things up soon because it's almost an hour into this review. There are a number of sections in the book that are like that, where things go on way too long, and I'm thinking of the hunt for Dracula's coffins, described in too much detail. The hunt to meet Dracula's ship as it comes into the port of Eastern Europe. Again, a little bit too much information about timetables and hotels and ship schedules and stuff like that. Though there are those sections which slow the book down. But then, once Lucy dies and turns into a vampire, that scene where they meet her resurrected as a vampire in the graveyard is just brilliant. And it's got everything you could wish for Gothic horror. The moon, the night in the graveyard, the shadowy, the figure in white coming down, holding a child that she's abducted. The dialogue between them, Van Helsing holding up the lantern and kind of shaking as he's holding it up. I mean, the dialogue is really good, but not only the dialogue, I think this is what I was talking about earlier. I think this is one of those moments where I think the prose is really quite effective. I think the prose sings there. So that's the section of the book that really works. I could go on. I've barely even talked about the second half of the book. But it's been an hour. This video is way too long as it is. I don't know why I can't be more concise. But here we are. Here we are. So if you've made it this far, thank you for indulging me. I'll try and say what I want to say in fewer words in the future, but we'll sign off here. Thank you, BookTube.